Now let's concentrate on the timeline up at the top here. First of all, the numbers that we see scrolling across the top represent frames, and that's going to be our measurement unit for an individual piece of our animation. Each one of these boxes represents a frame in the movie. Now we turn that number into time by using the frame rate. You can see that here at the bottom of the timeline, and if you have your document properties open, you can also see it down here in the document properties as well. Ours is set for 24 frames per second, so that basically means right here at frame 24, that would be 1 second in our movie. If we double that at frame 48, that'll be 2 seconds. Now obviously you can change the frame rate around. A good target number is a number between 20 and 30 because it'll give you a nice smooth animation. So we're going to leave ours at 24 for now. To work in the timeline, we're going to need to understand a couple of key concepts, and those are frames and keyframes. First, frames. I've already got frame 48 selected in the Chopper 4 layer up here at the top. So let's go up to the Insert menu, and under the Timeline submenu, I'm going to insert a frame. Now you'll notice I actually inserted a whole bunch of frames, and those are represented by the big gray bar going across here. You can see my chopper has been selected, but the stars and the buildings have disappeared. Well, that's because our timeline has moved forward. You see this red bar here? That indicates the frame that we're currently looking at on our stage. So right now we're looking at frame 48. You can see it up here in the indicator as well. To move the time around, we can simply grab this red bar. The most convenient place is up here at the top in the numbers, and just drag it around. And when we move it all the way back to frame 1, you can see that all of our other objects appear. It also kind of makes sense because there's a blank area on these two layers, and that basically indicates to us that those objects do not appear on those frames past frame 1. So let's go ahead and add some frames to those layers so that they do. I'd like to try a couple of faster ways. We still need to select where we want to insert frames to, and I'm just going to randomly pick out frame 25 here for the buildings layer. Now I can use the Insert menu, but I can also use a keyboard shortcut for this, and that would be pressing F5. Now some Macintosh computers, especially some of the notebooks, require you to press the Function key or the FN key while you're pressing any of the F keys. So just make sure you try that out if you're having any troubles. You can see that all those frames got inserted into our buildings layer, just like they did in our chopper layer. And as we move the timeline indicator around, all the way back at the beginning, our stars appear. Frame 2, they disappear. And of course, at frame 26, our buildings disappear as well. Now, one other fast way you can work in the timeline is by right-clicking. On a Macintosh, if you don't have a 2-button mouse, you can hit the Control key and click normally. Let's do that for the stars layer. I'm going to go out to frame 35. And I'm going to right-click on that layer. You'll see that I can insert frames right here. And we get the same effect. As you can see by now, the main goal of our frames is to increase the amount of time that something stays on the stage. Now, for animation, we actually want things to move around, and that's the job of our second item, the keyframe. So let's go ahead and create a keyframe for the chopper. I'm just going to place my keyframe at a certain point in the timeline. Let's say frame 30 here for now. I can do it the same way. I can go up to the Insert menu, go down to Timeline, and this time I'll choose Keyframe instead of Frame. And you'll see what I get is a black dot right where my keyframe drops in. So actually, we have a couple of keyframes already on our stage. They're right at the beginning of our timeline here. Now to show how keyframes change things, you can see that I've got that keyframe selected that we just made, and I've also got my copter selected, and I'm just going to grab it and move it a little bit over in the sky. What's interesting about keyframes is they allow you to save a change on the stage right at the keyframe's location in the timeline. If I move my timeline indicator back just one frame, you'll see that my helicopter is back where it originally was. So what we really have going on here is we've got one keyframe setting up the original position, we've got a set of frames holding that position for a while, and then we've got another keyframe coming along with a new position, and of course another set of frames holding that position. One more term that I'd like to introduce while we're at it is we actually have a name for this group here of the keyframe and the frames after it, and we call that a frame span. Now I can select blocks of frames using the Shift key, so if I click on this keyframe and I Shift click on the end frame there, I've just selected a frame span which starts off with a setting for position, and then frames for duration. When you see this white square at the end, that simply indicates the end of a span. Now there's a shortcut for adding more keyframes, just like there is for adding frames. Let's go over to frame 35 here and add another one. The keyboard shortcut is the F6 key. And once again, if you're having trouble getting the F keys to work, just look for that FN key on your keyboard. You can see we got another keyframe here, and we can point out exactly what happens when you create a keyframe. We create a place in the timeline where a change can be made, and the program also goes back to whatever the last keyframe was and copies the artwork forward. So that's why we have a copy of the helicopter sitting right here in this keyframe. It's going to be the exact same position as the old one. And if I click on the last keyframe, you'll notice it also moves the playhead back as well. And you can see that they're both the same right now. But with this copter selected, we can just move it a little bit forward again and make a change. And you can see that the old copter setting is exactly where we put it last time, and the original one back even further. In fact, if you move this around in the timeline, you can sort of get a preview of the animation that we've just created. We could keep going from this point and create lots more keyframes and create all of our animation that way. In fact, that's a technique referred to as frame-by-frame animation. I could just go to the next frame, frame 36. I'll press F6 to create another keyframe and move my helicopter forward just a little bit. Go up and create another keyframe, F6. Move it forward a little bit. Now, as you can see, this could get kind of tedious, and it might take a while. And I might mention that we're making a lot of copies of our helicopter artwork, which is going to make our file a lot bigger as well. Before we stop, though, I'd like to show a couple more things. First off, we can create keyframes using the right-click menu just like we used it to create the frames. I'll go up here to frame 40, I'll right-click, and you can see that we have Insert Keyframe here as well. Now, one other feature that you might have noticed on the Insert menu and here on the right-click menu is that we also have one option to insert a blank keyframe. Now, you'll notice every time we've made a keyframe so far, we've had a copy of the helicopter dropped onto that brand new keyframe. Choosing blank keyframe, you get exactly what you think you might get. We get a brand new keyframe, which is a dot, but it's a hollow dot instead of a filled one. And what that indicates is it has no artwork in it. And you can see that our helicopter's disappeared. When you create keyframes, you have an option of just putting whatever artwork you want in there. And a blank keyframe is a great way to either make room for new artwork or make something disappear from the screen, as it did here. Now, it's just as important to learn how to remove keyframes as it is to create them. So I'm going to get rid of these keyframes right here. It doesn't matter whether it's blank or filled, we remove it in the same way. If you want to use the menus at the top, make sure the keyframe you want to remove is selected. Go up to the Modify menu, and under the Timeline heading, you can choose Clear Keyframe. Now, you can see the keyboard shortcut for this is right here. Shift F6 will also clear a keyframe for you. There we can see that our keyframe has been removed, and it just restored whatever span was left behind it. You can also use the right-click menu. I'm going to click on this next keyframe here. I'll right-click. Remember, you can control-click on a Mac if you don't have a two-button mouse. And you can see, once again, we've got Clear Keyframe as one of our options. Now, I just want to mention this because it's kind of a natural thing to do. If you select a keyframe, you might want to just hit the Delete key. And let's try that out so that we know exactly what's going to happen. When I hit the Delete key, I didn't delete the keyframe, I deleted the artwork inside the keyframe, and that left me a blank keyframe. That's not what I wanted. So just for reference, the Delete key's not really going to work here. Now let me get rid of the rest of these keyframes all in a group. I'm going to click on the last blank keyframe that we just made, and I'm going to shift click, and that way I've selected this block of frames. I'll use my right click menu once again, choose clear, and this time it'll clear all the keyframes in the block. Now, one last thing I'm going to do before I go on, I really don't want my buildings or my stars disappearing during this animation. So I'd like to extend those keyframes all the way out to the end of the movie. To accomplish that quickly, what I'm going to do is go over here to the chopper layer, frame 60. I'm going to click and drag down, and you can see that by dragging down, I've selected frame 60 for all of my current layers. Now I can just press F5, and you can see that every one of my layers extends out to frame 60.